Let me tell you what happened the night my marriage nearly froze over. Literally. No, not because of an argument about money or in-laws or even who forgot to take Daisy out for her evening walk. No, this battle was fought over a glowing little box on the hallway wall. Yes, the thermostat. That tiny rectangle with its smug digital numbers somehow managed to turn two respectable adults into undercover operatives sneaking around our own house. It all started on a Tuesday evening, the kind of evening that feels perfectly harmless. My wife was cocooned on the sofa under what I can only describe as a blanket fortress, layers of fleece piled so high she looked like a queen surveying her kingdom from a snowy mountain peak. Meanwhile, I sat in my chair trying not to suffocate in what felt like a Florida swamp. I glanced at the thermostat. 74. My heart sank. 74 degrees indoors is not a temperature. It's an insult. It's what you get when you accidentally leave your car in the sun with the windows rolled up. I, being a rational man of science and comfort, rose from my chair and lowered it to a civilized 68. 10 minutes later, she shuffled past me without a word. Beep. Back to 74. She returned to her sofa, sipping tea with the calm satisfaction of a monarch who has just reclaimed lost territory. And just like that, the war began. Now, I know what you're thinking. Henry, why didn't you just talk it out like a mature couple? Ha, you must not be married. There are two things in a marriage that cannot be openly negotiated: the proper way to load the dishwasher and the thermostat setting. Both are battles fought in silence, with the kind of strategy that would make military generals take notes. So I did what any reasonable man would do. I waited. She got up to go make popcorn. Beep. Down to 68. I returned to my chair with the smug satisfaction of a man who had just restored order to the universe. She came back carrying a bowl, glanced at the thermostat, and raised an eyebrow at me. That was it. No words, just that eyebrow, arching like a drawbridge before an attack. She didn't even confront me. She just set the bowl down, walked to the hallway, and beep, 74 again. Now it was personal. I should mention that Daisy, our golden retriever, had chosen this exact evening to sprawl dramatically across the rug, sighing loudly as though she'd been drafted into our war as a neutral observer. Every time one of us walked past her to adjust the thermostat, her eyes followed us with the weary disapproval of a United Nations diplomat. The popcorn crackled, the dog sighed, and the house settled into an uneasy truce. For a while, neither of us moved. She pretended to watch her show, I pretended to read a magazine, but we were both listening, waiting for the other to make the next move. I tried to focus on the article in front of me. Something about 10 ways to save energy at home. Oh, the irony. I couldn't help but chuckle, which earned me a sharp look from the blanket fortress. She narrowed her eyes, and I quickly buried my face in the magazine as though I had just discovered an urgent news piece on the mating habits of penguins. But I was planning my next move. You see, a man can't just storm the thermostat again. No, I needed subtlety, a distraction, something to pull her attention away. I thought about asking her if she wanted more tea, but she would see right through that. I considered sending Daisy to cause a commotion in the kitchen, but Daisy's loyalty is fickle at best and usually swayed by who has the last cracker. Finally, opportunity struck. The phone rang in the kitchen. She sighed, set down her mug, and went to answer it. I didn't even hesitate. Beep. 68 victory. She returned, phone in hand, still talking, and glanced at the thermostat. She paused mid-sentence, narrowed her eyes at me again, then said into the phone, "Oh no, everything's fine here. Just a little climate disagreement." She gave me that look, the one that says, "This isn't over." And she was right, because not 5 minutes later, while still on the phone, she sauntered past the thermostat, her finger casually brushing the button like a pianist, hitting a single perfect note. Beep. 74. The audacity. I tried to stay calm. I reminded myself that marriage is about compromise, that love is patient and kind. But sweat was starting to bead on my forehead. My chair was sticking to my back. Somewhere outside, a cricket chirped, mocking me. I leaned back, pretending to adjust my glasses when in fact I was plotting. The living room had turned into a chessboard, and every move mattered. Should I wait until she went to bed and then strike? Or should I go bold now, risking open war? That's when I remembered the most important tool at my disposal, the remote thermostat app on my phone. Oh yes, technology had given me the upper hand. She might think she could win this battle with stealthy beeps, but I had the power of Wi-Fi. I casually pulled out my phone, scrolled a bit, pretending to check emails, and with a sly tap, 68, the Blanket Fortress Queen didn't even notice at first. She was too busy finishing her call. But then, slowly, her eyes shifted to the thermostat. She blinked, tilted her head. I could see the dawning realization. Her gaze snapped to me. You, I shrugged innocently. What? You're using the app? I grinned. It's called technology, my dear. Progress. Civilization. She glared. Cheater. And that's when I realized something chilling. She had the app too. Our eyes met in a standoff worthy of an old Western film. The dog sighed again. The popcorn had gone stale. The digital numbers on the thermostat flickered as though bracing themselves for the storm about to come. Beep. No, not beep. A chime. A digital chime from my phone. She had just overridden me. Back to 74. I stared at my screen in disbelief. She was faster than me. More cunning. This wasn't just a battle anymore. This was war on a new front. And let me tell you, it was only just beginning. Now, if you've never fought a silent war over a thermostat, let me tell you, it's not like regular disagreements. Regular disagreements have talking, maybe a raised voice or two. But thermostat wars? They're fought with glances, sneaky footsteps, and the occasional passive-aggressive cough. It's chess in slippers. That night, my wife and I both discovered what we were truly capable of when pushed to our thermal limits. The living room had become neutral territory, a demilitarized zone where neither of us dared approach the thermostat directly. She stayed burrowed in her blanket fortress, sipping tea, scrolling on her phone. I sat in my recliner, pretending to be interested in an old hardware catalog I'd fished out of the side table. Neither of us moved. The thermostat, glowing smugly in the hallway, might as well have been the crown jewels. Every few minutes, Daisy would lift her head, give a bored groan, and flop back down. The poor dog was caught in the crossfire of a climate cold war. Her fur was thick enough that 74 probably suited her just fine, but she had that golden retriever gift of sighing in ways that seemed judgmental. I decided stealth was my best option, so I waited until she laughed at something on her phone, probably a video of a cat attacking a cucumber, and tiptoed to the hallway. I thought I was being quiet, like a ninja, but slippers, as it turns out, squeak. She didn't even look up. She just said, "Don't even think about it." I froze mid-step, one hand hovering near the thermostat, like a thief caught red-handed. Slowly, dramatically, I turned back toward her. I was just stretching my legs. She didn't buy it for a second. I shuffled back to my chair, defeated. Clearly, this battle needed more advanced tactics. That's when inspiration struck. If I couldn't control the thermostat, maybe I could influence the environment in other ways. So, I excused myself to the kitchen, opened the freezer, and pulled out a box of popsicles. I returned to the living room, unwrapped one with exaggerated enthusiasm, and took a loud, satisfied bite. "Ah," I said, shivering theatrically. Nothing like an ice-cold treat on a balmy evening? She peered out from her blanket fortress, unimpressed. You're ridiculous. Ridiculously comfortable, I replied, crunching another bite. But here's the thing about popsicles. They melt fast. Pretty soon I was dripping red cherry syrup onto my magazine. Daisy perked up, hoping for a snack, and I had to wrestle the sticky stick away from her. My grand plan had turned into a mess, and the queen of the blanket fortress looked smugger than ever. Defeated once more, I tossed the stick and grabbed a paper towel. But I wasn't done. Oh no, this war had layers. Later that evening, when she went upstairs to grab something, I seized my chance. I darted to the hallway, phone in hand, and dropped the thermostat back to 68. Then, I turned on the ceiling fan for good measure. The room cooled just enough to give me hope. But when she returned, she didn't even blink. She simply pulled out her phone, tapped it once, and the thermostat chirped. Back to 74. You're not even pretending anymore, I said, exasperated. Neither are you, she shot back. Daisy gave another dramatic sigh, as if to say, can you two grow up? I realized then that this wasn't just about temperature. It was about principle, about territory, about who really ran the house. And in marriage, let me tell you, those lines blur. We spent the next hour like that, volleying temperatures back and forth. 68, 74, 68, 74. It was like watching a tennis match played on a thermostat screen. At one point, the poor thing froze, not literally, but the display flickered and went blank for a full 30 seconds before rebooting. Even the thermostat needed a break. By then, the popcorn was gone, Daisy was sulking in the hallway, and the house felt like two climates battling for dominance. I half expected a weather alert to pop up. Warning, microclimates forming indoors. Finally, we reached a stalemate. She glared at me over her tea. I glared back from my recliner. Neither of us touched our phones. The thermostat sat at 71, caught in the middle like a hostage. It might have stayed that way too, if not for Carl. Carl is our neighbor. You know Carl, the kind of man who owns 6 different grills and considers himself a weather expert because he once installed his own rain gauge. He has this uncanny ability to show up whenever chaos is at its peak. And sure enough, just as our house balanced precariously on 71 degrees, there was a knock at the door. I opened it, and there stood Carl, wearing his usual cargo shorts and a t-shirt that said Grill Sergeant. In his hands, a giant cooler. Evening, Henry. Brought over some leftover ribs from the cookout. Thought you might like a late snack. Now, I appreciate ribs as much as the next guy, but the moment that cooler entered our house, it became a new player in the thermostat war. The smell wafted through the room, rich and smoky. My wife perked up instantly, abandoning her fortress to grab a plate. Daisy practically levitated with excitement. And me? I realized I'd been handed a weapon, because nothing heats up a room like a cooler full of hot ribs. As Carl chatted away about smoke rings and mesquite wood, I glanced at the thermostat. Already the temperature was creeping higher from the steaming ribs. My wife, distracted by barbecue sauce, didn't notice. I quickly tapped my phone, dropping it back to 68. But fate is cruel. Carl, oblivious to our war, said, "Mind if I warm these up in your oven?" I froze. My wife beamed. Of course! The oven roared to life, radiating enough heat to bake a second batch of cookies. Within minutes, the living room felt like a sauna. She leaned back with a satisfied smile, licking barbecue sauce off her fingers, while I wilted in my recliner like week-old lettuce. I tried to lower the thermostat again, but the oven's heat was too much. 68 felt like 75. Carl, meanwhile, droned on about his latest grill modifications, completely unaware he'd tipped the balance in her favor. By the time Carl left, the ribs were gone, the oven was off, and the living room smelled like a smokehouse. My wife looked victorious, Daisy looked stuffed, and I I was already plotting my next move, because the night wasn't over. Not by a long shot. After Carl left with his cooler and his endless monologue about brisket rubs, I thought maybe, just maybe, the battle would settle for the night. The ribs had distracted her. Daisy was dozing off and the house had cooled back to something resembling livable. But no. That thermostat still sat there in the hallway like a smug little referee. And my wife, oh, she wasn't done. She waited until I leaned back in my recliner, half dozing, pretending to read but really just staring at the same page of my magazine for 20 minutes. Then, like a cat who'd been planning her pounce all day, she slipped out from under her blankets, padded down the hallway, and tapped the thermostat. Beep. Back to 74. I cracked one eye open. She looked over her shoulder at me, daring me to object. Then she slid back into her sofa fortress, tugged the blankets up to her chin, and sipped her tea. "Oh, so that's how it is," I muttered. She didn't even flinch. Now, in any sane household, two adults would have a civil discussion at this point. They'd talk about comfort zones, compromise, maybe buy a few extra blankets. But not in our house. No, we had entered the phase of silent one-upmanship. So I tried a new strategy. Decoys. First, I coughed loudly, like I was getting up to grab a drink. I walked toward the kitchen, casually detouring to the hallway, hand reaching for the thermostat. Beep. Dropped it back to 68. I returned with a glass of water, sipping nonchalantly. She eyed me, narrowed her gaze, and set her mug down. 2 minutes later, she got up to check on Daisy. Never mind that Daisy was snoring loudly on the rug, belly up and paws twitching like she was chasing rabbits in her dreams. My wife brushed past, tapped the thermostat. Beep, 74. I raised an eyebrow. She smirked. And so it went. Me with my coughing decoys, her with her checking on Daisy excuse. By midnight, I swear the thermostat was dizzy from all the back and forth. It must have felt like a light switch at a rock concert. At one point, I tried getting clever. I turned on the kitchen faucet, rattled a few pans, made a whole production, then darted into the hallway. Just as I reached out, I heard her voice float from the living room. "Don't even bother. I'm timing you now." I froze mid-reach, caught again. How does she always know? It's like she has some sixth sense connected directly to the thermostat. That's when I realized she must have planted traps, sticky notes to be precise. Sure enough, the next morning I woke up to find a neon pink sticky note plastered on the thermostat. In bold Sharpie letters, DONOTTOUCH. Now, I don't know about you, but when I see a note that says, "Do not touch," my first instinct is to touch whatever it's on. It's human nature. It's like putting a big red button in the middle of a room and telling people not to press it. Someone's going to press it. I stood there in my robe, staring at that sticky note. The thermostat blinked innocently behind it, like it wasn't part of the conspiracy. Daisy came trotting up, wagging her tail, and sniffed at the sticky note as if to say, "You gonna let her win?" Of course not. So I peeled off the sticky note, lowered the thermostat, and slapped the note back on. No evidence. Brilliant. Except, sticky notes aren't stealthy. When she walked by, she saw that the corner of the note was crooked. She gasped like she'd just found a crime scene. "You touched it," she accused. "I did not," I said, feigning innocence. "It's crooked. You definitely touched it. Maybe the dog brushed against it." "Daisy doesn't peel sticky notes and move them back," I shrugged. "Well, you never know. She's clever." That argument went nowhere, and the sticky notes multiplied. The next one said, "I mean it." The one after that, "Seriously, Henry." By lunchtime, the thermostat looked like it had been wallpapered in neon warnings, but I wasn't giving up. That afternoon, Carl came over again, this time with a story about his new smart thermostat. "See, Henry, I can control mine right from my phone." Set it to 72 while I'm at the grocery store. It even learns my patterns. I smiled politely while internally calculating how long it would take me to install one without her noticing. Probably impossible. She'd catch on the second I opened the box. Besides, the last time I brought home a smart appliance, it nearly ended our marriage. We'd gotten this smart fridge, right? It could make grocery lists, show recipes, even email reminders. One night at 3 in the morning, it pinged my phone with an alert. Your lettuce is wilting. I woke up in a panic, thinking the house was on fire. No, just lettuce. The next day, I taped a note on the fridge. Mind your own business. So yeah, another smart gadget was out of the question. Meanwhile, Daisy continued to provide unhelpful commentary. Every time the thermostat changed, she'd heave a dramatic sigh and move to a new patch of rug. 68 degrees, she sprawled out in the warm sunbeam. 74, she flopped belly first on the cool tile. The dog was Switzerland, neutral but noisy about it. By evening, the house was a battleground of sticky notes, sighing dogs, and passive-aggressive temperature shifts. I knew I needed a new tactic, something bold, something decisive. So I tried diplomacy. Listen, I said over dinner, why don't we compromise? Set it at 71. Not too hot, not too cold. She dabbed her lips with her napkin and shook her head. 71 still feels chilly to me. 71 feels like paradise compared to 74, I countered. Then maybe you should wear a sweater. I'd have to wear 2 sweaters and a hat, she smirked. Problem solved. Clearly, diplomacy was dead. That night we went back to our silent war. Beep, 68 beep, 74, back and forth like clockwork. Daisy gave up and went upstairs to sleep in the guest room, where the temperature stayed mercifully stable. And me? I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, plotting my next move. This wasn't just a standoff anymore. This was a full-scale campaign. Tomorrow, I promised myself, I'd escalate. And I did. Let me tell you, the thermostat standoff had already turned our house into a silent battlefield. Each side, maneuvering, plotting, striking, retreating. But that night, things escalated because of an unexpected visitor. Now, you need to understand something about my neighborhood. People don't just drop by, they orbit, they circle, they pick up on any little disturbance, like bees sniffing out spilled soda. And at the top of that social food chain is Carl. Carl is the kind of man who believes every conversation is an open invitation for him to contribute his wisdom, whether or not you asked for it. He once offered to show me the proper way to mow a lawn while standing on my grass wearing sandals and holding a cigar. He's retired, restless, and equipped with enough free time to poke his nose into every thermostat war within a 2-mile radius. So of course, Carl happened to stop by right in the middle of one of our stealth missions. I had just tiptoed into the hallway, socks muffling my steps, determined to drop the thermostat back down to 68 without triggering my wife's radar. She was in the kitchen humming and rattling around with dishes, which gave me a window of opportunity. I crouched low, pressing my back against the wall like I was breaking into a museum vault. I reached for the glowing little rectangle. 1 beep, 2 beeps, numbers dropping like sweet relief. 73. 72. And then, the doorbell. Now, a doorbell at night is not a neutral event. It's either a package, a problem, or a person who doesn't understand boundaries. And when I opened the door, there stood Carl in his windbreaker, holding a Tupperware of potato salad like it was a diplomatic gift. "Evening, Henry," he bellowed as though I were standing on a boat 200 yards offshore. "Just thought I'd bring this over before it goes bad." Linda made too much again. Behind me, the thermostat beeped again. My wife must have swooped in like an avenging angel while I was distracted. I could practically hear the smug hum of 74 degrees reasserting itself. Carl sniffed the air as he stepped inside without being invited. Boy, it's warm in here. You running the furnace or hosting a tropical vacation package? My wife appeared instantly, smiling in a way that said, "Ah, finally, someone normal who understands proper indoor climate." She gestured toward Carl. "See? Even Carl appreciates that a home should be cozy." Carl plopped down on our couch, the potato salad sweating through its plastic lid. "Well, Linda and we keep it around 72. Perfect balance. Not too hot, not too cold. You know, like Goldilocks, I wanted to tell him that 72 was the Switzerland of temperatures. Neutral, useless, boring. But before I could, Daisy the dog ambled in and flopped directly at Carl's feet with a sigh. Traitor. Carl leaned back and launched into a monologue about how he had installed a smart thermostat that he could control from his phone. He pulled it out of his pocket like a magician showing off a deck of cards. "Watch this," he said proudly, tapping at the screen. "I can adjust it from anywhere. Grocery store, fishing trip, even the dentist's chair. Technology's amazing." My wife's eyes lit up as though he'd just offered her front row tickets to see her favorite band. Oh, Henry, wouldn't that be convenient? No more sneaking around. We could just set it from the couch. I nearly choked on my own indignation. Or, I countered quickly, we could continue to use the perfectly functional thermostat that already exists. No need to introduce Wi-Fi into our hallway, Carl chuckled. Well, suit yourself, but it's the future, my friend. Pretty soon your fridge will be telling you when to buy milk. I muttered something about already having a fridge that tattled on wilting lettuce, but no one was listening. Meanwhile, Daisy, as if in solidarity with my wife, shifted into the only sunbeam left in the room, rolling over dramatically like she was auditioning for a weather commercial. She had chosen her side, and it wasn't mine. Carl stayed for what felt like 3 days, regaling us with tales of his golf league, his grandson's soccer team, and the exact specifications of his home insulation. I sat there, nodding at intervals, but my eyes kept drifting to the thermostat in the hallway, glowing like a neon sign for marital discord. Finally, when Carl stood up to leave, I saw my opening. As soon as the door clicked shut, I darted for the thermostat. Beep, beep, down to 68. Sweet, civilized, breathable air. I turned, triumphant, only to find my wife standing behind me, arms crossed, potato salad cradled in her hands like a trophy she'd won. "You know," she said sweetly, "Carl's right. A smart thermostat would solve this." And then she marched back to the kitchen, leaving me alone with the glowing box that seemed to be laughing at me. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just a disagreement. This was a campaign. And if Carl had inserted himself into our little domestic Cold War, there was no telling who else might get dragged in. I slumped into my chair, Daisy sighing dramatically at my feet. The potato salad sat ominously on the counter, mayonnaise glistening under the kitchen light, as if it too had taken sides. The thermostat beeped again. 74. The war was far from over. The next morning, I woke up with the distinct feeling of being slow cooked. The bedroom air was so heavy it felt like I was sleeping inside a bread oven. My wife, naturally, was buried under 3 blankets and looked as serene as if she were floating down a river on an inflatable swan. I checked the thermostat on my way to make coffee. 74. Of course, I tapped it down to 68, whispering under my breath like a gambler begging dice to behave. By the time I finished my coffee, it was back to 74. Clearly, we were past the point of casual disagreement. This was war on an industrial scale. I began drafting a mental list of strategies. Hide the thermostat under a framed photo. Install decoy thermostats around the house to distract her. Pretend it had broken and duct tape it into one setting forever. I didn't get far before Daisy padded into the kitchen and flopped dramatically onto the tile floor, panting. She gave me a look that said, "Buddy, you're in over your head." I just work here. The morning sun was barely up when the first outside observer joined the fray, the mail carrier. She pushed open the screen door, handed me a stack of bills, and said, "Boy, you folks keep it brisk in here. Makes me want to run a lap just to warm up." I froze. Brisk? Had I finally won a small victory? Maybe the thermostat gods were on my side after all. Then I noticed my wife behind me, smiling sweetly as she adjusted the dial right in front of the mail carrier like it was a demonstration model at a store. Beep, beep, back to 74. The mail carrier nodded approvingly. "Ah, that's better. Coziness is important." She waved and left, completely unaware she had just supplied my wife with valuable propaganda. I glared at Daisy. "Did you see that?" Daisy yawned, stretched, and relocated to her preferred sunbeam spot, which, at that moment, seemed to glow brighter than the thermostat itself. That afternoon, as if the universe conspired against me, my wife invited our neighbor Linda over. Now, Linda is Carl's other half, but where Carl provides unsolicited advice, Linda provides stories. Endless stories. She once told me in detail about her trip to Target that included the cashier's favorite breakfast food and a debate over shampoo scents. Linda came in holding a basket of muffins, and after a quick "hello," immediately said, "Good heavens, it's nice and warm in here." So cozy. My wife beamed like she'd just won an Olympic medal. She gestured toward me. "Henry thinks it's too hot." Linda gasped. "Too hot? Oh no, you can't let yourself get chilly at our age. That's how aches sneak up on you." She sat down and unwrapped the muffins. "I keep ours at 74, sometimes 75 if the grandkids are over. They love it." I bit into a muffin just to keep myself from blurting out something about how I was slowly being steamed alive like a dumpling. By evening, I had developed a new tactic: decoy noises. If I wanted to change the thermostat, I had to mask the sound of the beeps. I tried coughing loudly, dropping a spoon, even opening the fridge door at the same time. It almost worked, until Daisy betrayed me again by barking the exact second I hit the button. My wife appeared instantly, holding a laundry basket. "What are you doing?" "Checking batteries," I said, which made no sense since thermostats don't take AA batteries, but it was the best I could do under pressure. She raised an eyebrow, adjusted it back to 74, and walked away without a word. That silent victory march stung worse than any lecture. Later that night, while she was in the shower, I decided to strike again. This time, I created a decoy soundscape. I turned on the faucet, opened and closed the pantry door twice, even sneezed for good measure. I dropped it to 68, triumph at last, or so I thought. She came out of the bathroom, hair wrapped in a towel, glanced at the thermostat, and without breaking stride, tapped it back up to 74. Then she said, "Henry, it's like living with a rebellious teenager. If you can't behave, maybe we do need Carl's fancy smart thermostat that hit me right where it hurt," compared to Carl. No man wants to lose a war and be compared to Carl at the same time. I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling fan. It barely stirred the air, which felt like thick soup. Daisy lay sprawled on the rug, tongue out, the canine version of a protest. I decided tomorrow I'd have to escalate. No more casual button pressing, no more decoy noises. It was time to bring real strategy into this conflict. And just as I was drifting off, I heard it. Beep. She'd adjusted it again. In the dark, I whispered, "This isn't over." By the next morning, I had a plan. Not a good plan, but a plan nonetheless. I woke up early, even before Daisy, which almost never happens unless there's the smell of bacon or the promise of yard sale bargains. My strategy was simple. I'd set the thermostat to 68 first thing in the morning before my wife even got out of bed, and then distract her with enough errands, chatter, and activity that she wouldn't notice. If I could just get her through one day at 68, maybe her body would adjust. Like training for a marathon, but with sweaters. I shuffled into the hallway, slippers squeaking. Beep, Beep, 68 victory. I tiptoed into the kitchen, made coffee, and even reheated a muffin Linda had left behind, just to cover my tracks. When my wife came downstairs, she was cheerful, humming some old song while she poured herself a cup. For about 20 minutes, everything was fine. Daisy even flopped onto the rug with a sigh that felt like approval. I thought, this is it. This is the day I win. Then, my wife paused mid-sip, looked around and said, "Why is it so cold in here?" Cold? It was 68 degrees, perfectly reasonable. Doctors probably recommend it. Presidents have made important decisions in rooms cooler than this. She walked over, adjusted it back up to 74, and returned without a word. I realized then that brute force wasn't going to work. I needed stealth. I needed cunning. I needed Carl's advice. That afternoon, I happened to run into Carl while taking out the trash. He leaned on the fence, sipping a soda, wearing one of those hats with fishing lures stuck in it, even though the man hasn't fished since 1992. "Carl," I said, trying to sound casual. "Hypothetically, if someone were in a silent war over their thermostat, how would they win?" Carl grinned like he'd been waiting his whole life for this question. "Smart thermostat," he said immediately. "Get one you can control from your phone. She won't even know you're doing it." I hesitated. I still remembered his last bright idea, the time he convinced me to buy a voice-activated lawnmower that only understood commands if you shouted in a British accent. The neighbors still bring it up. But the thought of controlling the temperature without leaving my chair, tempting. Very tempting. That night, while my wife was distracted with a phone call, I did a little research on my tablet. These things could be installed in an hour, the websites claimed. Simple setup, easy as pie. I've never trusted that phrase. Easy as pie? Have you ever tried making pie crust from scratch? Still, desperate times call for desperate measures. The next day, I bought one. Brought it home in a discreet brown bag like it was contraband. Stashed it in the garage behind the lawnmower that demands a British accent. When I finally had the house to myself, my wife was out with Linda, who wanted to show her some fall decor inspiration at Target. I pounced. I ripped open the box and got to work. Now, I'm not what you'd call handy. I'm more of an instructions or suggestions kind of guy. So it should surprise no one that within half an hour, I had managed to trip the circuit breaker, shock myself twice, and drop a screwdriver behind the wall vent. Daisy sat nearby, watching me with her head tilted as if to say, "This will not end well, Henry." She was right. By the time I had wires sticking out of the wall, the front door opened. My wife's voice floated in. "Henry, why is the house so quiet? And why does it smell like singed hair?" Panic set in. I tried to shove the wires back into place, cover everything with the original thermostat, and whistle nonchalantly. But she walked in before I could even start whistling. "What are you doing?" she asked, holding two Target bags like a prosecutor holding exhibits A and B. "Routine maintenance," I said weakly. She crossed her arms. "On the thermostat," I stammered. "It sneezed." Her eyes narrowed. "Henry, if you so much as think about replacing this thing, you'll be sleeping in the garage." And just like that, the smart thermostat dream was dead. That evening, I sulked in my chair while Daisy sprawled dramatically across the floorboards. My wife sat under her fortress of blankets, scrolling on her phone with the air of someone who had just won the championship game. But then came my next idea, a sneakier, less electric shocky idea. Instead of replacing the thermostat, I'd outmaneuver it. If I couldn't change the numbers on the wall, maybe I could change the circumstances around them. Fans, space heaters, strategic window openings, environmental manipulation. It was genius. At midnight, while my wife was asleep, I quietly opened the bedroom window an inch. A cool, blessed breeze slipped in. I nearly wept with relief. Daisy hopped up onto the bed and sprawled in the airflow like she'd just discovered heaven. For the first time in days, I slept soundly. Until morning, when my wife woke up, saw the window open and shouted, "Henry, are you trying to turn this house into an igloo?" The war was far from over. Now I can live with many inconveniences in life. A garden hose that leaks just enough to give me wet socks every time I coil it. A teapot that insists on dripping in 3 different directions no matter how carefully I pour. Even a pair of slippers that, after years of loyalty, have evolved into 2 entirely different personalities, one sensible, one rebellious. But one thing I cannot, under any circumstance, accept is the sudden disappearance of my biscuit tin. This was no ordinary tin, mind you. It was the blue and white striped one my Aunt Doris gave me back in 1983. Slightly dented on one side from a particularly clumsy Christmas, but still sturdy. It had that comforting rattle when filled with biscuits, that faint squeak when opened, and an aroma that always hinted of ginger snaps, even when it contained custard creams. That tin wasn't just storage. It was tradition. It was loyalty. It was, dare I say, family. So you can imagine my shock when I opened the cupboard one afternoon, hand poised for a rich tea, and found nothing. The shelf was bare, utterly bare. "Henry," my wife called from the kitchen sink. "Did you put the biscuit tin in the freezer again?" A fair question. I once accidentally put the television remote in the freezer, right beside the frozen peas. But this time, I was innocent. I checked the countertops, the bread bin, even behind the toaster where old crumbs live like archaeological finds. No tin. I crouched down to inspect the lower cupboards, nothing but a suspiciously large jar of pickled onions and a bag of flour that had seen better days. I even opened the oven, which is usually biscuit-free, but one never knows. Empty. By now my mind had turned to darker possibilities. Could it have been stolen? Could someone have infiltrated my home, ignored the silverware, the television, and my extensive collection of novelty socks, and taken only the biscuit tin? My top suspect, Gladys, my neighbor. She has form. She once borrowed my rake for an hour and returned it 6 months later with glitter glued to the handle. She also borrowed my wheelbarrow, and it came back carrying a collection of papier-mâché flamingos. To this day, I don't know what sort of projects require both gardening equipment and glitter, but Gladys is a woman of mystery. Just as I was ready to march over and demand the safe return of my tin, I heard a strange sound coming from the backyard, a metallic clonk, followed by a suspicious shuffle. Detective instincts fully activated, I tiptoed outside, heart pounding like I was about to uncover a grand heist. And there, under the hydrangea bush, I spotted the criminal. It was my dog. His nose was dusted in crumbs, his paws suspiciously sticky, and beside him, lying dented and smeared with suspiciously familiar custard cream residue, was my precious tin. I froze. He froze. We locked eyes, like 2 outlaws caught in the middle of a train robbery. "Was it you?" I whispered, though the evidence was overwhelming. His tail wagged furiously, which I interpreted as both a confession and a shameless request for a second round. I couldn't help but be impressed. How had he managed to nudge the tin off the counter, carry it out the back door, and pry it open without opposable thumbs? It was equal parts scandalous and brilliant. That's when Gladys leaned over the fence, wearing her wide-brimmed sun hat and holding that same glitter-covered rake. She squinted at the scene and burst out laughing. "Looks like you've been robbed by your own household, Henry," she called. The dog thumped his tail proudly, as if he'd won an award. I sighed, picked up the tin, and gave it a gentle pat. It was a little more dented, a little less dignified, but still mine. The biscuits were gone, every last one, but the story it had given me was worth more than any custard cream. Later that evening, My wife shook her head at the crumbs still clinging to the dog's whiskers. "You really ought to keep that tin on a higher shelf," she said. But deep down, I knew this wouldn't be the last time the biscuit tin decided to play a starring role in the grand comedy of our household. The next morning, I awoke to find my dog sprawled across the rug like a victorious emperor, snoring with the satisfaction of one who had consumed an entire empire's worth of biscuits. His belly rose and fell like a bread loaf in the oven. The biscuit tin, now empty and shamefully dented, sat on the coffee table as Exhibit A in what I decided must become a formal inquiry. You see, in our neighborhood, crimes of this magnitude could not simply be ignored. We pride ourselves on order, dignity, and the occasional bake sale. A biscuit tin heist demanded justice, or, at the very least, a good laugh over tea. So I called for what we've come to know as a neighborhood tribunal. That's our fancy name for everyone brings a chair and sits in my backyard while Gladys talks too much. By 11 o'clock, the yard was filled. Gladys brought her folding chair, her glitter-covered rake, why she carries it everywhere, I'll never know, and a tray of brownies that looked suspiciously like they'd been baked with equal parts sugar and malice. Mr. Thompson from across the road showed up too, clutching his thermos of black coffee like it was state evidence. Even the postman lingered at the fence, pretending he just happened to be on his route. I placed the dented tin in the center of the picnic table. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, standing with the solemnity of a judge about to sentence someone for biscuit treason. "Last night, a terrible crime was committed within these walls." Gladys gasped loudly, clearly delighted at the drama. "Not the tin?" "Yes," I nodded gravely. "The tin." The dog thumped his tail against the deck, utterly unbothered by his crimes. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat. "I thought we were meeting to discuss the pothole at the end of the street." "We'll get to the pothole," I assured him. "But first, justice." I presented the facts. Exhibit A, the empty, crumb-smeared tin. Exhibit B, the paw prints leading from the kitchen to the hydrangea bush. Exhibit C, the dog himself, still licking phantom custard creams off his whiskers. Gladys leaned over the tin, inspecting it like a forensic expert. Looks like a blunt force entry, possibly a paw-assisted pry. Classic inside job." The postman whistled. "That's a clever dog you've got, Henry." "Clever, yes," I said, "but also deceitful. He betrayed the sacred trust between man and biscuit." Gladys wagged a finger at me. "Or perhaps you betrayed him, Henry." Leaving biscuits where temptation whispers, it was turning into more of a philosophy seminar than a tribunal. My wife, who'd been quietly sipping tea in her chair, finally interjected. "Or perhaps you all are forgetting the real issue. The biscuits are gone, and I didn't get a single one." The tribunal gasped. Justice had taken a new dimension. At this point, the dog, sensing the tension, stood, stretched, and ambled over to Gladys, who, traitor that she is, fed him a brownie crumb. He wagged his tail, sealing his popularity with the crowd. Mr. Thompson leaned back and sipped his coffee. "Well, Henry, looks like the jury has spoken." "Case closed." "Case closed?" I sputtered. "This was a crime against biscuits." But no one was listening. Gladys was already handing out brownies. My wife was smiling in her blanket shawl, content that the evening had turned into a neighborhood social. The dog had positioned himself strategically in the center, accepting crumbs and scratches like an honored guest. And so, just like that, my tribunal had collapsed into a tea party. The evidence was ignored, the criminal celebrated, and I was left with nothing but an empty tin and the faint smell of cocoa powder. That night, as I washed the dented tin and placed it back on its shelf, I couldn't help but laugh. In my house, even justice takes a back seat when there are snacks involved. By the following morning, I had accepted my defeat in the biscuit tribunal. The dog was a free man, the neighborhood had enjoyed their brownies, and I was left with crumbs of dignity. But one war had not yet ended. Oh no, The true battle was still simmering in the hallway, glowing faintly at me with smug little numbers. The thermostat. You'd think by this point my wife and I would have found common ground, some peace treaty perhaps. But no. The night before, while the neighborhood tribunal laughed and chewed, she had crept over and quietly nudged it back to 74. The gall, the audacity, the unspoken challenge. I woke up drenched in what felt like sauna condensation, my pajama shirt plastered to me like I'd just run laps in Florida humidity. Daisy the dog panted beside me, looking as though she was reconsidering his allegiance. Even my alarm clock seemed to be sweating. So I rose, noble, defiant. I padded across the hallway, wiped the fog off the thermostat screen, and restored balance to the universe. 68. But this time, I wasn't content to simply sneak. This was war, and I needed strategy. I grabbed a notebook from the junk drawer and began drawing battle plans like a general at his command tent. Operation Chill Factor. My first move, decoy noises. If she was in the kitchen, I'd cough loudly, rattle the fridge door, maybe even start the blender. In the cover of these dramatic sounds, I'd slip in, tap the thermostat, and retreat. Smooth, efficient, foolproof. The first attempt worked like a charm. She never suspected a thing, and I strutted back to my chair, satisfied. But 10 minutes later, beep. Back to 74. The woman was a ninja. Round 2. I waited until she stepped into the shower. The moment the water hissed, I darted into the hallway like a cat burglar. Beep, 68. Victory. Except when she emerged, hair wrapped in a towel like a regal crown, she gave me a look. That knowing look. She didn't say a word, didn't even break stride, just tapped it back to 74 with the poise of a queen reclaiming her throne. And so, our day continued. 68-74. Back, forth, back, forth. Daisy the dog, now thoroughly exhausted by the fluctuations, gave an exaggerated sigh every time the air kicked on. He'd flop dramatically from one side of the rug to the other, as though auditioning for canine theater. By mid-afternoon, I was desperate. That's when salvation, or so I thought, arrived in the form of neighbor Carl. Carl popped in through the back gate, holding a tool belt and an iced tea, the way only Carl could. He leaned against the porch railing and said, "Henry, why don't you just get one of those smart thermostats? Control it from your phone. Easy as pie." Now, I'm not what you'd call technologically blessed. The last time I tried to upgrade, we ended up with that so-called smart fridge that emailed me at 3 in the morning to say your lettuce is wilting. But Carl made it sound so simple. Just hook it up, download the app, boom. You're in charge. I pictured myself lying in bed, smugly adjusting the temperature with the flick of a thumb. My wife would never see it coming. It was genius. So naturally, I asked Carl for help. Within minutes, he was unscrewing the old thermostat while I stood nearby, nodding like I understood the tangled mess of wires spilling out. "Yellow goes to Y, red goes to R," he muttered. I coughed into my fist. Of course. Of course. Classic wiring. Half an hour later, we had it mounted. Shiny, sleek, a glowing screen like something out of Star Trek. Carl handed me my phone. "Download the app. You'll love it." And at first I did. I tapped the app and just like magic, the numbers danced. 68, then 74. Then 68 again. I was like a wizard, a sorcerer of indoor climates. I waited until my wife walked by. Casually, without moving from my chair, I tapped my phone. Beep. Down to 68. She froze mid-step, eyes narrowing. Beep. Back up to 74, beep, down again. It was glorious. The power surged through me like caffeine after a nap. But here's the thing about technology. It never plays fair. By evening, the thermostat had apparently joined forces with my wife. Somehow it synced to her phone too. I don't know if Carl gave her the code or if she simply charmed the machine into submission, but suddenly, I wasn't the only wizard. So now, as we sat across from each other in the living room, it became a digital duel. Tap, tap, tap. The numbers flipped back and forth like a tennis match. 68-74, 68-74. Daisy groaned loudly, burying his head under the sofa cushion. The lights flickered once, as if the house itself was begging us to stop. And then, just to mock me, the thermostat app glitched. The screen froze, the numbers blinked, and the house temperature shot up to 82. 82. Indoors. I staggered to the window, gasping for fresh air. My wife fanned herself with the TV guide, glaring at me. Daisy lay spread-eagle on the tile floor, tongue lolling like a Victorian damsel. Carl, who was still in the yard sipping his iced tea, peeked in and called, "Might need a firmware update," before strolling away as if he hadn't just sabotaged my marriage. By midnight, we gave up. The smart thermostat was officially smarter than both of us and possibly more stubborn. My wife and I retreated to separate blanket fortresses on opposite ends of the sofa, glaring across the battlefield. The war wasn't over, not by a long shot, but as I lay there, fanning myself with a throw pillow, I had to admit, it was the most ridiculous, wonderful standoff of my life. By the next morning, I had decided to call a truce, not because I'd given up, but because I was physically melting. I woke up with my hair plastered to my forehead, Daisy panting like an overheated steam engine, and the thermostat blinking some kind of error code that looked suspiciously like it was mocking me. I shuffled into the kitchen, clutching a glass of water, and found my wife already there, calm as could be, sipping coffee like she hadn't just waged a full-scale climate war the day before. She raised an eyebrow over her mug. "Sleep well?" I wanted to say. "No, I spent the night in a swamp and I think the furniture has mildew now," but instead, I muttered, "Like a baked potato." She smirked. "That's the thing about marriage. It isn't really about who wins or loses. It's about how much amusement you can squeeze out of the nonsense." And this thermostat nonsense was ripe for amusement. Still, something had to change. Carl's so-called smart thermostat had turned our home into a gladiator arena, and Daisy was threatening to move in with the neighbors. So, I made a proposal. "Listen," I said, trying to sound diplomatic, "we clearly can't both control the thermostat. So how about we set rules?" She tilted her head. "Rules?" "Yes, like a peace treaty. One day your temperature, next day mine." She thought about it, swirling her coffee, eyes narrowed in that calculating way she gets when she's 2 steps ahead of me. "And what about days when it's unbearable?" I grinned. "That's what sweaters and fans are for." It wasn't a perfect solution. It was more like duct tape over a leaky pipe, but she nodded slowly. And just like that, the thermostat standoff entered a fragile ceasefire. Now, don't get me wrong, the system wasn't flawless. On her days, I bundled myself up like an Arctic explorer, muttering about igloos and frostbite. On mine, she lounged with an ice pack on her forehead, sighing dramatically like a fainting Victorian heroine. But somehow, it worked. The funniest part was how quickly the neighbors picked up on our little arrangement. Carl, of course, couldn't resist spreading the news. At the next block cookout, he announced loudly, "Henry and his wife are running their house like Switzerland now. Neutral zone with alternating control." I swear, I saw 3 neighbors jotting notes like they were about to implement the same plan. And Daisy? Well, Daisy adapted better than anyone. He learned to migrate according to the thermostat setting. On my days, he sprawled happily in the sunny patch, basking like a lizard. On her days, he tunneled under blankets, looking like a furry loaf of bread. Honestly, I think he enjoyed the variety. But the real kicker came about a week later. We'd just finished dinner when the mail carrier knocked on the door. Same guy who once commented, "Boy, you folks keep it brisk in here." He handed me a package, then leaned casually against the doorframe. "You two ever figure out your thermostat feud?" he asked with a grin. My wife and I exchanged a look. Without a word, I gestured to her, and she gestured to me. Then we both burst out laughing. "Sort of," I admitted. "We're alternating days now." He chuckled, shook his head, and said, "Smartest thing I've heard all week." Then he tipped his cap and walked off like some kind of postal philosopher. Later that night, as we sat side by side on the sofa, her with her blanket fortress, me in my t-shirt and shorts, I realized something. The thermostat wasn't really the enemy. It was just the stage. The stage for a play we'd been acting out for years, the silly, petty, wonderful squabbles that make a marriage, well, a marriage. And in that moment, I didn't care if it was 68 or 74. I was just glad to be sitting there with her beside me, Daisy snoring softly at our feet, the house humming gently around us. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let the warmth, or was it the cool, settle over me. It didn't matter. What mattered was that the war was over, the treaty was signed, and the kingdom was at peace. Well, at least until laundry day. Because if you think the thermostat standoff was bad, you should see us argue about whether socks belong folded or rolled. But that's a story for another time. So, my friend, if you've stuck with me through this long and silly tale, let me leave you with this. The next time you find yourself grumbling over something small, be it the thermostat, the dishwasher, or who left the light on, remember that those little battles are just proof you're living life together. And that, my friend, is worth all the sweat and shivers. If this gave you a laugh tonight, subscribe for more bedtime giggles. Good night.